This is a presentation on Amendment 41 to the Snapper Grouper Fishery Management Plan, and it deals with management measures for mutton snapper. My name is Myra Brower, and I'll be walking you through this presentation. So a little bit of background. First of all, the Council needs to pursue action because there was an update to the stock assessment of mutton snapper in the southeastern U.S. that was recently completed. That was CDAR 15A, and it was done in 2015 with data through 2013. Now, mutton snapper are considered a single stock that extend across the South Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico jurisdictions. So the two councils had to come up with a way to split up the acceptable biological catch. So currently, 82% of the ABC goes to the South Atlantic and 18% goes to the Gulf of Mexico. And they came up with those percentages using a formula that looks at 50% of average landings from 1990 through 2008, and the other half, the other 50%, are the average landings from 2006 through 2008. So that's what's currently in place for mutton snapper. And these figures here show you what came out of this update assessment that I was just telling you about. So you can see the overfished determination. Mutton snapper are currently not overfished. They are not undergoing overfishing. And then you have all the other biological parameters and reference points that need to be adopted that were produced through these latest assessments. So the Council would revise the maximum sustainable yield, the minimum stock size threshold, or MSST, and then adopt the acceptable biological catch for this species that was recommended by the SSC. These are the current fishing levels. So we have an OFL, or an overfishing limit, and there's the corresponding value, which is in pounds whole weight. The ABC, the acceptable biological catch for the South Atlantic, is currently at 926,600 pounds whole weight. The ACL is set at the same level, and then the allocations are 17% commercial and 82% recreational, and that puts you at an ACL for the commercial sector of 157,707,000 pounds, and the recreational ACL is much larger, 768,893 pounds. There's also in place a recreational annual catch target. And this is to give you an idea of how the ABC is going to change. This is just an excerpt of the table from the stock assessment that shows you the projected ABC values for each year going forward. So if you look at the 2017 row, you see that the landed pounds correspond to 717,200. And then if you apply that 82%, which is the portion that corresponds to the South Atlantic, you can see that the proposed ABC for 2017 goes down to about 588,000 pounds. So why is the ABC going down so much? So basically there were some improvements that were made to the modeling technique, and then there were additional years of data. And so the new assessment has estimated a smaller adult population right now compared to what the assessment in 2008 estimated. And several things could have contributed to this, even though the two models are very different. The methodologies are very different, so it's difficult to make direct comparisons. But there are at least three things that could have contributed to this. The MRIP, or the Marine Recreational Information Program, calibrated landings that were used in the update are very different from those that were in the original assessment. And that's because the original assessment, we didn't have MRIP back then. We had the MRFS program, the Marine Recreational Fishery Statistics Program. So those landings are different. And also the update, as I said earlier, included several more years of data. Actually 7 years, that is a little bit longer than what a typical update usually includes. And also the original assessment was done with fewer samples for growth and reproductive parameters. So we have more data and better data than back then. So Amendment 41 is going to update all these benchmarks based on the most recent assessment and update the ABC. and then also revised fishing levels based on new acceptable biological catch, so your ACL, your ACT. And then accordingly, there's going to need to be some revisions to recreational and commercial management measures. The first action addresses the MSY, the maximum sustainable yield. It is the largest long-term average catch that can be taken from a stock under prevailing ecological and environmental conditions. So for snapper grouper species, MSY was initially specified in Amendment 11, but at that time we didn't have a lot of information on many species, and so the MSY was not actually specified. There was a proxy. The F30% SPR was used as a proxy, but there was no value associated with it. So selecting a definition for MSY is going to allow for subsequent revisions to that value when the stock assessment becomes updated, and that way the council is not going to have to take action every time a new assessment is done. So that's what preferred alternative 2 would do, and you can see on the table what the MSY value would be, 912,500 pounds whole weight. Action 2 addresses the minimum stock size threshold. This is the level below which a stock is considered to be overfished. So again, currently we don't have a value specified for mutton snapper, and the council has 2 alternatives to choose from. Either set it at 50% of the spawning stock biomass at MSY, that is the population, the spawning population for mutton snapper, and you can see the corresponding value there on the table, or they can set it at 75% of that spawning stock biomass at MSY. The council recently changed the definition for this parameter, the MSST, through a regulatory amendment, Regulatory Amendment 21, which was effective in November of 2014. And they did this for a handful of snapper grouper species that had low natural mortality. If you can see under the no action alternative, there's the M parameter in that equation corresponds to natural mortality. So what happens is when the natural mortality is low, less than 0.25, there can be very small fluctuations in the biomass of a population that are not due necessarily to fishing, but they may be due to environmental conditions or natural variations in that population. And then if you consider if you have that MSST set at that level that includes the natural mortality parameter, then you run the risk of having a stock that is flip-flopping between an overfished and a rebuilt condition that is not biologically accurate. And so to avoid that, the SSC recommended that for certain species with low natural mortality, the MSST could be set at 75% of SSB MSY. So that's what the council intends to do for mutton snapper as well. Action 3 addresses the annual catch limits, your ACLs, and your optimum yield, and you can see what is currently in place, which I've already mentioned. And then the table below shows you what is proposed according to the council's preferred subalternative, which would set the ACL at the same level as the OY, at the same level as the ABC. So the table shows you by year the total ABC, which includes the Gulf, and then the South Atlantic ABC in numbers, the corresponding yield in pounds, and then the ACLs according to those same sector allocations. So you can see that the ABC in this table is specified in numbers, and the recreational ACL is also specified in numbers of fish. This is because the South Atlantic Council is trying to move towards doing that for their managed species, because the recreational landings are tracked in numbers of fish, whereas the commercial ACLs are tracked in pounds, so it makes sense to be consistent with that determination. So the problem develops when there's also a corresponding proposal for an increase in the minimum size limit, which is the case for this species, and I will tell you about that in a few more slides. So because larger fish are going to weigh more if the minimum size limit is increased, the fish being landed on average will correspond to a higher weight. So if the method that we use for converting between an ACL in pounds and an ACL in numbers doesn't address this change in average weight, then the expected increase in the average weight of landed fish could lead to the poundage that's associated with the ACL specified in numbers exceeding the ACL specified in pounds. So basically, specifying the ABC and ACL in numbers is going to result in a lower risk of overshooting the ABC and the OFL. So that's just a little bit of an explanation for why it's being done a little bit differently than the council's specified ABCs and ACLs, recreational ACL in particular for other species. Here is just to give you an idea of the landings over the last 5 years. You've got, for the recreational, you've got it in numbers and in pounds whole weight, and then the means across the bottom. So over the last 5 years, 112,000 mutton snapper have been landed recreationally, and for the commercial, on average, that sector has landed about 77,000 pounds. So in order to determine whether management measures, changes in management measures are needed, the council can just very quickly take a look at comparing the proposed ACLs to the mean landings over the last few years. So if you just do that crude calculation, the proposed ACL for 2017 for the commercial sector would be a little over 100,000 pounds. And that sector, as I just mentioned, has landed on average about 77,000 pounds. So there doesn't look like a reduction in harvest would be needed for the commercial sector. Looking at the recreational, the proposed ACL for 2017 is 116,000 fish and some change, whereas the mean landings on average have produced 112,000 fish. So we're getting kind of close, and also keep in mind that that is an average. In fact, I believe 2014 landings were above 116,000 fish. So the council is then having to consider changes to the recreational management measures to make sure that the ACL is not exceeded. So I'll tell you about those coming up. Action 4 deals with this recreational annual catch target, which basically ACTs can be used to prevent ACLs from being exceeded. So for fisheries that don't have an in-season control to prevent the ACL from being exceeded, managers can use ACTs that are set below ACLs, and then when the ACT is reached, then that triggers an accountability measure. However, the council hasn't so far chosen to utilize ACTs in managing the snapper grouper fishery, but they go ahead and specify them as a matter of course in case this value becomes part of the management strategy for snapper grouper species in the future. So currently their preferred is to set that ACT at 85% of the ACL, which would put it at 98,708 pounds whole weight. There is a table in your scoping doc, in the public hearing summary, that has those values based on each of the ACL alternatives in both pounds and in numbers of fish. Okay, and then here's where we start getting into the proposed changes to the current management. Action 5 deals with increasing the minimum size limit for mutton snapper. Currently it's at 16 inches total length. So the council is considering several alternatives, including 18 inches total length, which is their current preferred, and it's indicated in bold on your screen. And this is part of the rationale for this is because recent evidence has indicated that the size at 50% maturity for male mutton snapper is 16 inches, whereas for females it's actually 18 inches. So by increasing the minimum size limit, the council is protecting part of the reproductive portion of the population, which obviously is a good thing. So this table here shows you the projected catch based on these various size limits. So this is, you have on the left-hand side of the table your size limit. This is looking at a bag limit of 10 per person per day, which is currently, which is what's in place right now. Mutton snapper are part of the 10 snapper aggregate, so you can land as many as 10 mutton snapper per person per day. So at the 16-inch minimum size limit, keeping the bag limit at 10, your estimated landings are 112,089 fish. So that's a 0% reduction. That's status quo. Going down to the 18-inch minimum size limit, your estimated landings go down to about 29,500 fish. So that is quite a reduction. So you can see that this proposed increase in the minimum size limit is going to have quite an effect on the recreational landings going into the future. Action 6 is an interesting one because currently there is a lot of concern. Folks have come to the Council and to the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission with concerns about possible overexploitation of mutton snapper during the spawn. Mutton snapper form spawning aggregations in Florida and Florida Keys, and of course there's concern that that's a very vulnerable time for fish to be exploited. And so the Council and the Fish and Wildlife Commission would like to specify a time during which possible stricter regulations would be in place to specifically protect the spawning population. So they are looking at 3 different alternatives, and right now their preferred is to set that quote-unquote spawning season from April through June. So those would be the months where possibly stricter regulations could come into play to protect the spawners. They're also looking at a modification to the bag limit. So as I said previously, mutton are included in the 10 snapper aggregate, and there's no additional restrictions for the recreational sector during May or June, which is when the spawning, when they're aggregating to spawn. So they're looking at retaining mutton snapper in the 10 fish aggregate, but specify a bag limit during the months that they're not spawning. So from July through March, if they go with their current preferred. They're looking at possibly decreasing that bag limit to 4 fish per person per day, 5 fish per person per day, or 10 fish per person per day. And then during the spawning season, so if they went with the April through June option that is currently their preferred, they're looking at a whole suite of actions: 2 per day, 3 per day, 10 per vessel per day, 12 per vessel per day, or no retention. And further, they are looking at another alternative which would retain mutton snapper in the aggregate but would specify the bag limit year-round. And that is currently their preferred alternative, and they're looking at reducing the bag limit to 3 fish per person per day. So this would be a year-round reduction. And here's some preliminary analyses that show you more or less what you can expect in terms of landings. So the top table shows you the bag limits, the proposed bag limits during the spawning season and the proposed bag limits outside of the spawning season. And this analysis is for the preferred, so April through June. And so at for example, 3 per person during the spawning season and 4 per person outside of the spawning season, you would be looking at landings of about 29,463 fish. But if you look at all the numbers in the table, they all sort of remain about the same amount. So there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of difference in the bag limit, and that is because in general, most recreational fishermen are not catching their bag limit. They're catching 3 to 4 maybe mutton snapper, and that's as much as they catch. And so these bag limits that are being considered are really not going to have that much of an impact. Then if you look at the bottom table, this one shows you the council's preferred, which is the 3 per person per day year-round. And so again, the biggest difference is in the size limit. You have size limits across the top. And so for the preferred 18-inch size limit, minimum size limit, you're looking at landings of about 29,000 fish. For the commercial sector, also the council is looking at revising management measures. This sector actually does have a restriction in place during May and June. So during those months, they're restricted to 10 mutton snapper per person per day, or 10 per person per trip, whichever is more restrictive. The council is looking at putting in a poundage limit, a trip limit during the regular season, and they're looking at a range between 300 and 500 pounds. Currently, their preferred is a 300-pound trip limit for those non-spawning months. And then during the spawning months, again, April through June, if they go with their preferred, the trip limit, or the possession limit rather, would be 3 fish per person per day, same as for the recreational sector. And they are looking at the same suite of alternatives, including no retention during the spawning months. And again, here, these are preliminary analyses. This is basically just a graph that shows you the trends in commercial landings over time. So we're looking at data from 2010 through 2014, and just focus on the green line, and you can see that the highest landings are during the May-June spawning season, which obviously, even though there is a restriction in place, that doesn't seem to be really constraining the commercial harvest of mutton snapper. And then if you look at landings per trip, and this is in expressed in pounds per trip, you can see that the majority of trips are landing below 200 pounds, and most of them below 50 pounds. So this shows you that what's probably happening is there's many more trips that are being taken during the spawning months. And if you just look at the number of trips that went into this calculation, so these numbers here, and you just quickly just divide to figure out the average trips that were taken for each month. During May-June, the average was 705 trips per month based on these numbers. And for the rest of the year, the average number of trips was 314 trips per month. So there seems to be a lot more activity during when these fish are spawning, which is obviously of concern. There's also, in your public hearing summary, there's a figure, figure 5, that shows that about 20% of the trips that took place between 2012 and 2014 actually landed in excess of the 10 fish possession limit. So there's also that to consider. Again, some preliminary reductions in commercial harvest. If you look at the poundage trip limit during the regular season, you're looking under the preferred at a possible 6% reduction in commercial harvest. And then if the council goes with their preferred for reducing the possession limit during the spawning months, that would equate to an additional 28% reduction. So overall, you're looking at a 34% reduction in commercial harvest. Again, these are preliminary analyses. We still need to figure out how these per vessel alternatives would affect commercial landings. And I should also mention that these tables were generated based on a minimum size limit of 16 inches. So this is not considering the increase in the proposed minimum size limit either. So that's a quick summary of what you can expect to see in Amendment 41. We're going to be doing public hearings coming up in August. In September, the council is going to review whatever comments are submitted and make changes to the amendment accordingly. And then in December of this year, they're scheduled to approve it for formal review, which means that somewhere in the summer of 2017, the regulations would be effective. And here's where you can, where we'll be. We're having a webinar on August 2nd, starting at 6 o'clock. There's going to be a Q&A session first. I will be the one conducting that, and then you're welcome to submit your public comment at that time. There will also be 3 in-person meetings in Florida on the 15th, 16th, and 17th of August, and you can see the locations on the screen. And all this information also, I should mention, is available on our website. So to submit written comments, we ask that you use the online public comment form, which is available, as I said, on the website, and you can see the link on your screen. You can send in comments by mail as well, send them by fax, and if you have any questions, my contact information again is on the screen, and you can also find it on the website. Comments that are received by 5 p.m. on the 19th of August are going to be included in the summary that is presented to the council at their meeting in September. You can still submit comments after that, but if that's the case, then those comments are still going to be part of the public record, but they're not going to be available on the briefing materials that the council gets to look at in December. So just making sure that everybody understands. So please, we encourage you to submit your comments online about this amendment and plan to attend the public hearings next month. Thank you for your time.